Hi, I'm John McOwen, a teacher at E-Bible Fellowship. Today I'd like us to take a look at the timeline of history that the Bible has to offer. Have you ever been intrigued about what happened from the very beginning of time when God created the world in 7 days and where we are today? Have you ever wondered how many years have transpired since the time that God created the universe? Well, fortunately for us, the Bible offers a description, a map. It gives us a calendar of the time from the very beginning of creation all the way to today. So I'd like for us to take a look at the scriptural evidence that suggests that the earth is only 13,000 years old, not billions of years old, as some scientists would like you to believe today. It begins in Genesis chapter 5. The calendar God created is given to us in Genesis chapter 5 and in also chapter 10 and 11. But in chapter 5, God says in verse 3, "And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth." The key for us to understand what the timetable in the Bible is all about, how to interpret it, is based on the understanding of the word begat and the understanding of the words called his name. We see the word begat many times in the Bible. Have you ever wondered if that was a direct son or child of the person named? Because when you look at every verse in the Bible that talks about a certain individual begetting another child or a descendant, the key to understanding God's timetable is recognizing that a direct son is correlated to the evidence he gives us when he uses the Hebrew word quara Shem, and that is called his name. For instance, in Genesis chapter 21 in verse 3, and I'll turn to Genesis chapter 21 in verse 3, we're going to read there how God says in this chapter, we read in Genesis chapter 21 verse 3, "And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac." Right there we see the Hebrew word quara Shem, which means called his name. That was a direct son of Abraham. His name was called Isaac. The word begat implies either a father-son relationship, or it can be a descendant later than a son. We see here in Genesis chapter 5. Let's go back to the very beginning chapter in Genesis chapter 5. That starts God's calendar. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 32, we read, "And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth." Now we know that there were only 8 people saved on the ark. And we know that Noah's 3 sons were saved. And here the Bible says Noah was 500 years old and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So there the word begat implies, or definitely refers to, a direct father-son relationship. But in many other instances in the Bible, the word begat simply means it was a descendant. It could be a great-grandson, a great-great-great-grandson, or even further down the line than that. That's the key to recognizing how God puts the calendar in the Bible. When we look at Genesis chapter 10, for instance, in verse 21, Genesis 10:21 says, "Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born." And then down throughout the next 9 verses, the Bible lists all the different descendants of Shem. And in verse 31 of the same chapter, Genesis 10, it reads, "These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations." Here, the word begat is used about Shem, but it does not mean his direct sons, because so many different descendants are listed during these next 10 verses. That's just one example. But let us now take a look at Genesis chapter 5, and we're going to go to chapter 5 and verse 3 that we said earlier was the very beginning of God's calendar. We're going to notice here that God gives 10 ages of men that lived before the flood of Noah's day. Following the flood of Noah's day, he gives us 15 different generation markers, or men, and how long they lived up until Solomon's death. So we're going to take what the Bible says, and we're going to begin in chapter 5 and verse 3. The Bible says, "And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth." So we see right away that Adam lived 130 years. He begat a son We're not sure if that is a direct son or not, but we know from the next phrase, and called his name, Quarashem in the Hebrew, that it was a direct son of Adam. His name was Seth. So we start with 130. If we had a notepad, you'd put down 130 as the very beginning, the first generation. Adam lived 130 years. He begat Seth. So then Seth, we see in verse 6, Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. The word begat is used. The Bible doesn't say he called his name Enos. Are we sure that that Enos was a direct son of Seth? Well, we can tell, fortunately, from chapter 4, a chapter earlier in verse 26, God said, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So we know from that verse that Enos was direct son of Seth. So we have Adam lived 130 years, then Seth lives in verse 6 105 years, and he begets, or he has Enos is born unto him. So then we have 105 plus 130. So those are the first two ages or time periods that we're going to put down on our notepad. The very next generation marker, the third one, would be Enos. How long did Enos live? Well, we read in verse 9 of the same chapter, Genesis 5, and Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. But interestingly enough, the Bible does no longer use the term Quarashem, or called his name. And that is the key to unlocking the biblical history, the timetable that's in the Bible. Because Enos lived 90 years, he didn't have Canaan then, because the very next verse says Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. So what God is teaching us here is that Enos, his generation was 905 years. For Adam lived 130 years, then he had Seth. Seth lived 105 years, then Enos was born. But Canaan would have been born the year that Enos died, and that would have been 905 years after he was born. We see from the scriptures here that God is giving us generation markers to mark time. The very next verse, we're going to go to the fourth person now, in verse 12. And Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalalel. Now, Canaan did not have Mahalalel when he was 70 years old. He would have had a son who would have eventually had another son, who would have had another son, and then Mahalalel was eventually born the year that Canaan died. So Canaan lives 70 years, and he begets Mahalalel. Verse 13 says, and Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years and begat sons and daughters. So now we see here in verse 14 that all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. So we had Adam lived 130 years, Seth lived 105 years, he has Enos. Enos lives 905 years, and then Canaan is born. Canaan lives 910 years, and then the next generation marker, he had Mahalalel. In other words, Mahalalel was born when Canaan died. In verse 15 of Genesis 5, Mahalalel lived 65 years and begat Jared. And Mahalalel lived after he begat Jared 830 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. So we see here that Mahalalel lived 895 years. And that is the next number we're going to put down, because the generation of Mahalalel was 895 years. But the next person that God's going to pick up the calendar with is Jared. Jared was not born when Mahalalel was 65 years old. A great-great-great-grandfather of Mahalalel's would have been born to Canaan when he was 65 years old. But Canaan was born, and he lived 910 years. Mahalalel is born when Canaan died. So Mahalalel lives 895 years. In verse 18 of Genesis 5, Jared now lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. So God does the math for us. He tells us that Jared was 962 years old when he died. And Enoch, we see here that one of his great-great-great-grandfathers would have been born to Jared. When we see here in verse 18, he was 162 years old, but Jared lived 962 years. Then he begets Enoch. So now let's go to verse 21 of Genesis 5 as we continue the calendar. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Notice again, very conspicuously, God leaves out the term Quareshem, or called his name. So we now know that these are not direct sons. These are great-great-great-great-grandchildren that are born, but God uses each man's lifespan, and then when he dies, the next generation marker, that person is born. So we see that Enoch only lived 365 years, and God took him, because in verse 24 it says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was raptured by God. So after 365 years, Methuselah would have been born. Now Methuselah, in verse 25, lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived, after he begat Lamech, 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And here we have the oldest man listed in the Bible, Methuselah. 969 years he lived. So he's the ninth person now that we put down on our list. And Methuselah, when he dies, Lamech is born to him in verse 28. Lamech was born in the line of Methuselah. When he died, Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. So now we have 182 for Lamech. What does the very next verse say in verse 29? And he called his name Noah. So he now, for the very first time since Seth had a son Enos and called his name, we now have a generation marker, Lamech, who lived 182 years, and he called the name of his son Noah. So now we know that Noah was a direct son of Lamech. So although Lamech continued to live after that, we only have 182 that we need to put down for Lamech's lifespan as far as the generation of Lamech was concerned. Because now God is very interested in his son Noah, naturally, because the flood would occur in Noah's life. So we continue to read in we should now go to Genesis chapter 7, because Lamech conceived, his wife conceived Noah. He was born when Lamech was 182 years old. But now in Genesis chapter 7, verse 6, we read, Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. So now we can take a look and see all the men that we've just listed, the generation markers that God gives us in the Bible. And we see that Noah lived 600 years, and then the flood came. So how many years transpired from the creation of the world and Adam, the very first man, until the flood? Well, Adam lived 130 years and begat Seth. Seth lived 105 years, and he had Enos as a direct son. Enos lived 905 years, and one of his descendants, Canaan, who was a great-great-great-great-grandson of Enos's, he lived 910 years. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Enoch, 365, and when he was taken by God, Methuselah was born, lived 962 years. When Methuselah died, Lamech was born, and he lived 182 years. Noah lived 600 years, and then the flood came. If we add all those numbers together, we get 6,023 years. Those 6,023 years are the amount of time that transpired between the creation of the world and the flood of Noah's day. Now, unless we have a date in history we can go to and backtrack, we may not be sure at this point exactly when in history that was. When did the flood of Noah's day occur? Well, we have to continue to work the calendar that the Bible gives us. So now we know that the flood happened 6,023 years after creation. We can now go all the way to Genesis chapter 11, where God tells us some information after the flood. In Genesis 11, verse 10, these are the generations of Shem. Now, Shem was one of Noah's sons that was on the ark with them. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. That's a key word. That's a key phrase. 2 years after the flood. We know the flood happened when Noah was 600 years old. In verse 11, and Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. So now Shem is the next generation marker that God's going to use in his calendar. So what do I put down for Shem's lifespan? How long did he live after the flood? Because we know that 6,023 years takes us from creation to the flood. How much longer did Shem live in the generation of Shem? Well, we know that Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years. But he begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So now we need to put 502 years for how long from the flood until Arphaxad would have been born in Shem's line. Well, let's continue. In verse 12 of Genesis 11, Arphaxad lived 530 years, which is 35 years, and begat Selah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403 years, and begat sons and daughters. And Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber. Well, let's take a look now. Arphaxad, how old was he? How long did he live? Well, he lived 35 years and begat Selah, and Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403. So what is 403 plus 35? God's no longer adding the numbers for us like he did in Genesis 5. It's a little bit tricky now because we have to do the math ourselves. Notice when Shem had Arphaxad after 502 years in his line, he didn't call his name Arphaxad. It was a descendant. It was a great-great-great-great-grandson. And here, Arphaxad was 35 years old and begat Selah, but he did not call his name Selah, so it was not a direct son. Selah would not have been born until Arphaxad died. Arphaxad then lived 438 years. The 35 years he lived, he begat a son who became the great-great-great-grandfather of Selah. And Selah would have been born when Arphaxad died. And it says here, Arphaxad lived 403 years after that he begat Selah. So, we now know that Arphaxad is our next name on our list after Shem, after the flood, 438 years. Let's go to verse 14. Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Selah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters. So now what do I do for Selah? Again, I add the numbers. 30 years in verse 14, he begat Eber, and he lived after that 403. So 403 plus 30 is 433. So Selah lived 433 years before he died. He's our next generation marker. We put that down. Who was born in Selah's line, his family line? The year that Selah died, Eber was the one who was born, as we saw there in verse 15. Now, how about Eber? How long did he live? Look at verse 16 in Genesis 11. And Eber lived 430 years and begat Peleg. And Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. So Eber lived, if I add those two numbers together, 464 years. Peleg lived 30 years. He's the next one, and begat Reu. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters. So how long did Peleg live? If I add those two numbers together, it's 239 years. Who was born the year that Peleg died? Well, let's take a look now at verse 20. And Reu lived, so Reu was the one who was born the year Peleg died, 32 years, and he begat Sereg. And Reu lived after he begat Sereg 207 years and begat sons and daughters. So we have the same thing. We have 32 years plus 207, and that gives us 239 for Reu also. So interestingly enough, Peleg lived 239 years. When he died, Reu was born. Reu lived 239 years as well. When Reu died, Sereg would have been born. Verse 22, Sereg lived 30 years and begat Nahor. And Sereg lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters. Well, then we know that Sereg lived 230 years if we add those numbers together. Verse 24, Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. So how long did Nahor live? We have to add the numbers 29 and in verse 25, 119, and we get in this case, we have Nahor lived 148 years. Well, Terah, in verse 26, lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now we have an interesting break in God's calendar, because we have Terah lives 100, in this case, he lives 70 years in verse 26, and he begets Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now, are they direct sons? Are they great-great-great-grandchildren? How do we know? Well, we have to take a look and see in chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 11. Was Abraham a direct son of Terah? He was. Look now at verse 27 in Genesis chapter 11. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, Haran, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. So we see that Abraham was a direct son of Terah from the evidence the Bible gives us here. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So Terah here, we see he lived 205 years, but when he was 70 years old, he begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now we have to figure out, how old was Abram, and how long did Abram live?